A dog stayed at his owner's grave day and night, and everyone was confused until they discovered why. Funerals are always sad for everyone involved, but what about the animals who get left behind? Usually, these pets are taken in by relatives or given to a shelter so that they can find their new forever home. However, the dog in this story did something very different. Sergeant was a German shepherd who loved everyone he came across. He had originally started off as a police dog, which is where he met his handler, a 32-year-old officer called Ian. At the time of meeting Sergeant, Ian had only been a police officer for a couple of years, but he had always loved the idea of working in the canine department. When Ian finally met his four-legged partner, he couldn't have been happier. The police officer and Sergeant hit it off right away, and were quickly trained to respond to each other in all kinds of situations. Ian and Sergeant spent lots of time together, and the four-legged canine even came to live with his handler. That way they could always be in tune with one another should an emergency happen and they were called in. But as time went by, Ian came to love Sergeant as if he was a member of his own family. The two would end up doing everything together, from sleeping on the sofa to taking long walks in the park. When the dog was off duty, he loved to play with everyone the two came across on their walks. One day, Ian and Sergeant were sitting in a patrol car when all of a sudden, a call came through over the radio about a robbery that was happening close by. Ian immediately started the car sirens up and began to make his way to the scene. The police officer had been told over the radio that he would be pursuing two suspects who had attempted to rob a nearby house but had been spotted by the owner. Ian arrived at the scene only to see the two suspects running away on foot. The man drove after the criminals, determined to catch up with them and arrest them. But just as he was about to get close enough to stop them, the two men ran into some nearby woods. Ian stopped the car and went into the woods. Due to how close Ian had been to the scene of the crime, he'd been the first to arrive at the location. This meant that he didn't have any backup apart from Sergeant, who'd been barking from the back of the car the entire time that they'd been in pursuit of the criminals. Ian knew that he shouldn't go after the two men as he didn't know what they could be armed with. He had no one to back him up should he find himself in a bad situation. But at the same time, he didn't want to let the two dangerous men get away so that they could potentially hurt other innocent people. Taking a deep breath, Ian opened the car door and called his canine to his side before the two of them ventured into the woods. Ian ran through the dense trees, following Sergeant, who had picked up on the scent of the two men. A few moments later, Ian heard one of the men muttering to himself just a few feet ahead of him. The officer got out his gun and began to silently creep closer to the unsuspecting man. Ian told the canine to stay where he was as he didn't want to risk the dog getting hurt. But as the policeman made his way into the small clearing where the criminal was, he realized that there was only one man standing there. Just as Ian was about to look around for the second man, he felt an incredibly sharp pain in his side. It turned out that the second man had snuck up on the police officer and hurt him with a knife. Sensing his handler's distress, Sergeant charged into the clearing, ready to help however he could. The feisty canine immediately began to attack the two men. He bit the one who injured his owner and did not let go of the man's arm, no matter what the criminal did to try and get him off. Eventually, the second man came over and managed to pry the angered canine off of his partner with a large branch. Sergeant was injured in the process. Finally free, the two criminals ran off into the woods once more, away from the sound of coming police sirens. Sergeant made his way over to his fallen owner, but Ian was gravely injured. The loyal canine began to bark to help lead the backup police officers to their location. Once the two injured police officers were found, they were rushed to the nearest hospital to be treated. Sadly, though, Ian's injuries were too severe, and he passed away. With his handler gone, Sergeant fell into a deep depression. The canine did not know what to do, and didn't want to interact with anyone else. He was deemed unfit for duty due to his mental state, and the saddened pup was given to Ian's family so that he could live out the rest of his life with people he knew and loved. Not long after Sergeant was sent to live with Ian's family, the day came for the police officer to be buried. Everyone from the police station, along with Ian's family and Sergeant, attended the funeral. As the man's coffin was lowered into the ground, Sargent began to bark and whine, as if asking for his owner to get up and give him a cuddle like he used to. Sadly, it was not meant to be. As the funeral came to an end, Ian's family began to make their way towards the car to go home, when his wife Shelley noticed that Sargent was missing. Not wanting to lose another beloved family member, Shelley went in search of the canine. Eventually, she found him, lying down next to Ian's grave. Shelley tried to take Sargent away from the grave, but nothing the woman said or did got the dog to move. Eventually, she tried to grab the canine's collar to get him to go with her. However, when she reached for him, Sargent began to growl. It was clear that no one was going to get him to move from his master's grave that night. Not knowing what else to do, Shelley left the dog at Ian's graveside, believing that she'd be able to pick him back up the next day. However, the following day, Sargent was just as determined to stay at the grave as he had been the night before. Over the next few days, the loyal dog did not move from his spot. Shelley would return twice a day to make sure that the dog had something to eat and drink before leaving the heartbroken pup to guard his lost owner. One day, as Sargent was guarding his deceased owner, one of Ian's friends from the police, a man called Sean, approached the grave to drop off some flowers and some food for the dog. But as Sean stood at Ian's grave, Sargent suddenly began to growl for the first time in days. The dog stood up and moved away from the grave and towards two voices, which the canine could hear coming from the street. Curious, Sean followed the agitated pup until he was able to see what had upset the dog. Walking along the road were the two men who had injured Sargent and Ian. Upon noticing the criminals, Sargent immediately leapt into action and bit into the leg of one of the unsuspecting men. The man screamed in terror and fell to the pavement, where the angry canine was able to keep him pinned down with the threat of biting his neck. The second criminal tried to make a run for it, but he was quickly stopped by Sean, who was able to subdue and handcuff him. Before long, the two criminals were arrested and taken back to the police station. Sargent, however, walked back to Ian's grave. The dog gave one last little whine before walking away back to Sean. It seemed the pup had fulfilled a promise to capture the men who had taken Ian's life. With the criminals safely behind bars, Sargent lived the rest of his life with Shelley, content to visit Ian's grave on occasion instead of staying there all day and night. Thanks to this amazing dog, two dangerous criminals were put behind bars, and the police officer was able to rest in peace. Let us know what you think of the story in the comments below. Can we give this loyal dog 10,000 likes?